and speaking today. My name is Kelley Loper, and I'm the one of the deputy directors of the Center for Comparative and Public Law, which has organized this seminar. And I'm also the director of the LLM and Human Rights Program in the faculty. Okay, so what I plan to do today in my presentation is to take a look at some of the interactions and the conversations that have taken place in recent years between the Chinese government on the one hand and international human rights monitoring bodies, the international human rights system, on the other hand. And these conversations have been about how best to ensure the rights of persons with disabilities excuse me, in the Chinese context. I'm actually losing my voice today, so you'll have to forgive me if I take several sips of water throughout my talk. Okay. I'll also reflect on the possible impact that these discussions have had, or might have the potential, on the realization of disability rights and the role of civil society, and why the role of civil society is particularly important. I'll start out with some background information for you. Those of you how many of you who have actually are familiar with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities already? Some of you have a lot of knowledge. Okay, some of you might not have as much background, so I'll try to provide just enough background to those of you who aren't as familiar with some of the concepts. So I'll start out with this background about the significance of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is one of the most recent, and I would argue probably the most detailed and extensive of the UN, core UN human rights treaties. And I'll then mention a few issues related to China's approach toward its disability policy that the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has identified. And the committee is the expert monitoring body at the UN that's tasked with evaluating the progress that states have made toward better protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. Now, the committee also provides advice and recommendations to states, and also interpretive guidance on the meaning of key provisions and concepts in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I'll now refer to in the rest of my presentation as the CRPD, okay, which is much easier. Okay. Now, these issues that have been identified in the Chinese context, and also the nature of the discourse and discussions between the Chinese government and the monitoring bodies, I think are quite interesting because they illustrate what happens when state policy that reflects the old medical model of disability, and the medical model of disability focuses on individual impairments, and the solution to individual impairments is medical intervention. So when these policies based on the old medical model are evaluated according to a new social or human rights model, which characterizes disability as external to the individual, as external barriers to participation and inclusion of people with impairments in society. So there's a distinction between impairment and disability. So the new human rights model clearly conceptualizes disability very differently, and because the CRPD's provisions reflect this model, they often impose quite extensive and sometimes unexpected obligations on states. And I say unexpected, this is especially from the perspective of states, including China, who are still very much grounded in the medical model of disability. And I would argue that most governments actually are still very much grounded in the medical model of disability, based on a review of the jurisprudence and the materials produced by the CRPD committee so far. And I think this is a key issue, this clash between the medical model and the human rights model, a key issue and a theme that arises consistently in the work of the committee. So So in other words, a study like this of the international monitoring of China's disability rights record can actually reveal these points of tension between the old model of disability and the human rights model, and the specific problems and examples of these problems that this tension creates for implementing human rights at the domestic level as they apply to people with disabilities. Excuse me. I'll then consider how, as I mentioned, how civil society organizations, especially disabled persons organizations, which are often referred to as DPOs, have gotten involved in these discussions and how these groups can impact the outcomes of human rights monitoring as well as the outcomes of domestic implementation. Now, the international human rights system I think, presents a lot of opportunities for advocates to influence the development and the interpretation of human rights law at the international level. And this is because when these groups access the UN human rights monitoring system, they often are providing very useful information about real issues and actual problems facing people with disabilities at the local level. And the monitoring bodies can then take this information into account when they're evaluating state reports and interpreting international human rights law more generally. I think it's quite interesting to observe in the Chinese context that civil society organizations working on disability rights, and with some exceptions, seem to have a bit more space to operate than groups working on what are perceived to be, anyway, more contentious human rights issues. Now, ironically, this space probably reflects the predominance of the medical model of disability in Chinese policymaking circles. So when people with disabilities are characterized according to the medical model as weak, as dependent, in need of charity, medical attention, then the responses based on the medical model may actually seem to pose less of a threat. Okay, so applying the human rights paradigm, which is what's required by the convention, by the CRPD, would lead to a very different result and might be perceived as more threatening. So I think it will be important to watch how the disability rights space might expand or perhaps contract as the government learns more about the implications of the human rights model and the CRPD as it interacts and has these discussions with the UN human rights monitoring bodies. And then finally, at the very end of the presentation, I and my colleague Bonnie will introduce a new online database that we've developed at the center that aims to provide information in both English and Chinese, and the Chinese will be in traditional and simplified characters, to these organizations that are working toward better implementation of disability rights in China, including Hong Kong. And it includes relevant treaties, international interpretive materials, summaries of comparative case law, Chinese law, manuals, advocacy toolkits, NGO reports, and academic literature on the human rights obligations that China has agreed to fulfill by ratifying this convention. And the idea of the website is to facilitate and support the meaningful involvement of these groups in international human rights monitoring as well as domestic implementation. And the website will also share information that was generated during the course of discussions that we had among DPOs and NGOs from the mainland and Hong Kong that have occurred at a series of annual workshops that have been hosted by the center since 2012. And more broadly, I think this portrait that I'm going to paint of the CRPD's implementation in China is significant because it provides some insights into debates about the effectiveness of international human rights law and international human rights monitoring more generally. So in other words, can the UN human rights system actually have an impact on the realization of human rights on the ground? Often my students are very skeptical of that claim. Not the students who attended today, of course. And what is or should be the role of civil society, including DPOs, in enhancing the effectiveness of the system? How does this all work, and how does this fit together? These are key problems in the human rights field, and the website will also provide a rich source of data for researchers working on these issues. International human rights monitoring, of course, often involves this wide range of actors: government, civil society, international experts, UN bodies, and it can result in very complex horizontal and vertical exchanges of information between these actors at the global, the national, and the local levels. And in this way, international human rights law, although it does often seem very remote and vague, can develop and be interpreted in response to real issues, and can therefore, at least in theory, therefore become more effective. So the human rights monitoring and implementation processes are not meant to be, or shouldn't be, top-down exercises. So it's not the UN simply telling states what to do, but it should be interactive and participatory at all levels. And I think this reflects the core nature and the rationale of the human rights movement globally, and the principles of participation and inclusion that are included in all of international human rights treaties. And so this is essentially, that was a long introduction. This is essentially, I've said practically everything I need to say, but this is the story that I want to share with you today. Okay. So first of all, as I mentioned, the text of the CRPD, to a very large extent, reflects the movement within the disability rights field away from the medical model of disability toward the social or the human rights model of disability. And this has important implications for the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities. And so experts such as Gerard Quinn have gone so far as to label the convention and the movement toward the human rights model as a paradigm shift. And as I mentioned, the medical model defined disability with reference to individual impairments, and the solution was often medical treatment, rehabilitation, and perhaps charity. Okay, it didn't conceptualize people with impairments or with disabilities as the bearers of human rights. Now, the social model, on the other hand, defines disability, as I mentioned, as obstacles in the environment and in society that limit participation of people with impairments. So a staircase without an accompanying ramp, for example, will likely exclude people who are in wheelchairs. And the preamble of the CRPD explains that, in this paragraph here, that it's this interaction between environmental and societal obstacles and people with impairments that creates disability. It's not the impairment itself. So a more extreme version of the social model might imagine an ideal world where people with impairments are just accepted as part of human diversity, and where environmental obstacles, and therefore disability, have been addressed and no longer exist. Right? So you can imagine a world of people with impairments without disability. Now the concept of universal design, which is described and explained in the CRPD, reflects this approach. So products and structures should be designed to allow use by anybody, regardless of the nature of that person's impairment. And all of us have impairments. I mean, I have legs, I don't have wings, I can only move so fast. We all have our own impairments, okay, but our impairments probably tend to be the normal types of impairments, or the more common types of impairments that are already catered for in society. We have cars and buses and trains to help us. Now, a former student who is blind pointed out to me last year that the iPhone is an example of universal design, which I hadn't really thought about. Whether it was intended to be or not, I'm not sure, but it is. Now, I would argue that the human rights model takes the social model one step further, and it clarifies that core human rights principles, such as dignity, equality, and participation, apply when states are determining how to address disability, how to dismantle the barriers to inclusion and to find other solutions. In other words, policy choices about disability have to comply with human rights norms more generally. Okay, so it takes the social model and it adds the human rights principles and the content. In this way, the CRPD expands the boundaries of human rights discourse even further than the other core international human rights treaties. It provides more concrete guidance and examples about how to interpret these vague terms, or seemingly vague terms, and gives us greater insights into their meaning. So one example, in order to achieve equality on the basis of disability, and of course equality is a core human rights principle, the convention makes it very clear that it's often necessary to provide accommodation. So this might involve physical adjustments to the environment. It might entail changes to the curriculum in the education system, or maybe a public awareness campaign to try to eliminate stigma about disability. So in other words, equality has to be substantive, real, actual equality in fact and in practice. And governments have positive obligations to change or to encourage change in society. So the convention reinforces and adds to our understanding of the right to equality as a substantive right in international human rights law more generally. Okay, so I think this has been another impact. It's not just, the convention has not just had an impact on people with disabilities and the rights of people with disabilities, but it's had a huge impact on the development of international human rights law. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. So to achieve equality, governments must do more than just simply refrain from discriminating, which is more of a negative obligation. They have to take action. So in fact, the convention explains that the denial of reasonable accommodation, so the failure to take action, not taking a positive measure, is actually a form of discrimination. Now the concept of participation is also very important. And many of the provisions in the convention are aimed at ensuring participation and inclusion of people with disabilities in all areas, so education, employment, the political system, etc. So structures that actually segregate people, such as special schools or sometimes psychiatric institutions, would run counter to the ethos of the convention and the obligations that the convention imposes on states. And also the convention's drafting process was quite unique because civil society organizations, including DPOs, participated to a greater extent than any previous human rights treaty drafting process. And the DPO rallying cry at the time was "nothing about us without us." And this phrase continues to resonate within the international human rights movement. The CRPD also contains the full range of civil, political, social, economic, and cultural rights. And many of the provisions in the convention demonstrate that these categories of rights cannot really be clearly separated or delineated. Instead, I think the convention reinforces the idea that all human rights are interrelated and interdependent, in contrast to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, where you have two different categories of rights in two separate, distinct treaties, which is a product, of course, of the Cold War split, ideological split between communist countries and capitalist countries. My former colleague, Carol Peterson, has observed in her work that the inclusion of robust obligations to ensure civil and political rights of persons with disabilities in conjunction with their economic and social rights is especially important in China. since China has not yet ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So in a way, the CRPD is a means of getting civil and political rights into China through the back door. Now, the convention was adopted in 2006, came into force in 2008. It has 154 state parties that have agreed to abide by the terms of this treaty. The treaty created a committee of independent experts, which I mentioned, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the committee monitors states' progress in the area of disability rights in a number of ways. So first, all state parties have to submit reports periodically every few years, detailing what they're doing to try to implement their duties under the convention. And the committee will ask questions, and it will engage with the state in what's referred to as a constructive dialogue. It's supposed to be a constructive dialogue, a very polite, diplomatic give and take. And then it will issue concluding comments, which will include some positive points usually and some recommendations for improvement. Okay. So implementation in China. Now, China was actually one of the first states to sign and ratify CRPD. It took it quite seriously. And it was only the fifth state to report to the committee. This was after Tunisia, Spain, Peru, and Argentina. And however, I mean, despite its enthusiasm, seeming enthusiasm for the convention, a review of the summary records of the discussions between the committee and the Chinese government delegation, and the committee's concluding comments reveal that the Chinese government generally misunderstood the meaning and the implications of the human rights model as reflected in the CRPD, and the implications on policy choices in the Chinese context. So for example, when outlining its disability policies, the government delegation frequently referred to statistics and practices related to medical intervention and rehabilitation. And the committee's initial list of issues, oral questions, and concluding comments seem to be an attempt really to address and correct the Chinese government's misunderstanding and reinforce the social and human rights model of disability as an interpretive tool. Now, in fact, the committee is quite explicit about its concerns in relation to China right away in the very first paragraph in the section of the concluding comments called Principal Areas of Concern and Recommendations. And the committee took note of the prevalence of the medical model in both the definition of disability and the enduring terminology and language of the discourse on the status of persons with disabilities. It expressed concern about the lack of a coherent and comprehensive disability strategy to implement the human rights model of disability. And according to the committee, the solution to this problem in Chinese policy requires participation and inclusion. So again, we're seeing these principles coming to the forefront. And the committee expressed concern that organizations of persons with disabilities outside of the CCPL, which is essentially a government body in China, are not included in the implementation of the convention, and urged the introduction of comprehensive and inclusive national plan of action, which includes full participation of all representatives of persons with disabilities in China to introduce the human rights model of disability. In other words, inclusion and participation are prerequisites to, as well as the outcomes of, the human rights approach to disability. I should note that the disconnect between the committee and the Chinese government when it comes to the meaning of disability is not unique to the committee's interactions with the Chinese government. I mean, this tension, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, actually emerges throughout the work of the committee and its discussions with most, I'll go out on a limb and I'll say most state parties. All right. So at the beginning of my talk, I argued that the sort of complex interactions among civil society, government, UN monitoring bodies, the committee, other UN monitoring bodies, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, have this potential to create momentum for change and better implementation of human rights. And these interactions, I think, are examples of what Harold Coe has called transnational legal process. And again, my students would be all too familiar with these arguments. I'd like to share just a few examples of how these processes have played out in practice in relation to the issue of the right to education, the right to inclusive education, that's set out in Article 24 of the CRPD. And again, these examples illustrate the tension between the medical and the human rights models of disability. Now, Article 24 requires that states, including China, ensure inclusive education at all levels to realize the right to education without discrimination. And the provision goes on to elaborate the nature of inclusive education and what states have to do in order to comply. So for example, people with disabilities must not be excluded from the general education system. Inclusive education should have certain aims, so including the full development of human potential and sense of dignity, strengthening of respect for human rights, development of the full potential of persons with disabilities, and also to enable people with disabilities to participate effectively. And inclusion may also require reasonable accommodation, so it's not just about simply integrating people with disabilities into mainstream schools with no support. So such a scenario actually could undermine these aims of education in Article 24 and lead to further exclusion. So there's also a distinction between inclusion and integration. And I know that in Hong Kong, the terminology that's used refers to integration, although it may amount to more than integration and maybe sort of going further toward actual inclusion. Now, it became clear during the reporting process, when the Chinese delegation reported to the CRPD, that China was not necessarily distinguishing between inclusive education and special education. And their emphasis was really on ensuring that children with disabilities have access to compulsory education, full stop. And in order to achieve this goal, policymakers were increasing the numbers of special schools for people with disabilities. Okay? So rather than channeling the resources into making regular schools more inclusive and providing reasonable accommodation, they were setting up new special schools. Yeah. Okay. Actually, I should have said at the beginning, if anyone, many of you are experts, so please, jump in and provide more information. Or at the end, if you want. Oops. Sorry, let me just lost my notes. It's the problem with doing this electronically. Right to education. Okay. So in its concluding comments, the committee expressed concern about this, which is in this quote on the slide, that there is a high number of special schools, and they had a policy of actively developing these schools, and that the committee was especially worried that in practice, only students with certain types of disabilities or impairments, physical disabilities or mild visual disabilities, were actually able to attend mainstream schools. So other children with other disabilities are forced to either enroll in a special school and be segregated or drop out altogether. Now, the committee reminded the Chinese delegation that this concept of inclusion is one of the key notions in the convention, and it should be especially adhered to in the field of education. And then it recommended that China reallocate resources toward inclusion in mainstream schools, away from the development of special schools. Now, the review of China's report took place in September of 2012, okay, and there will be another reporting process next year. No, Emily's shaking her head. Yeah, well, it's supposed to be. Okay.
Another 4 years.
Well, okay. Yeah, sometimes states report quite late. Those of you familiar with international human rights treaty monitoring will know states don't report on time, and the committee often has a backlog of reviews anyway. So it may not be next year. But anyway, the first reporting process took place in September of 2012. And in February of 2012, the Center for Comparative and Public Law organized a workshop for independent, and I say independent, it was very careful about the organizations that were invited to attend, NGOs and DPOs from China, and mainland China and Hong Kong. And this workshop was about the international human rights monitoring processes, how these work, and also the provisions, the concepts, and content of the CRPD. And at the workshop, the groups that were participating compiled a list and a description of issues related to China's implementation of the CRPD based on their extensive experience working as service providers and advocacy organizations on the ground. And these lists were then indirectly channeled to the committee through alternative reports submitted by other civil society organizations. Most of the groups that participated in 2012, except for the Hong Kong groups, Hong Kong groups were quite active in submitting alternative reports and going to Geneva, and they have actually wonderful, Emily has a wonderful video that we should put on our website.
I have a new one.
You have a new one.
I have a new one because it's all about our attending the CRPD, the CRC, and the
CRC and CDOT. Okay, good. Yeah, we have to put that on the website. So the Hong Kong groups were quite active, but most of the mainland Chinese groups were a bit wary of the process and decided not to submit their own alternative reports, but they wanted to share the information that they had and ideas, and wanted these to be included somehow and presented to the committee. So that's what happened. Some of the issues that they raised in relation to education included inconsistent and inaccurate statistics in China's report to the committee, the lack of resources, especially in rural areas, for teacher training and materials for students with disabilities, the lack of implementation of teacher training, low rate of admission to universities by people with disabilities, and the lack of inclusive education, especially for those with severe sensory or intellectual disabilities. Now, it's quite clear, I think, when you look at the issues that were raised by NGOs and DPOs that were eventually contained in alternative reports to the committee, that these issues certainly influenced the committe's formulation of their views about how China was doing in implementing its obligations. And I think this is reflected in the concluding comments and other statements during the actual constructive dialogue, which comes out in the summary record, which you can find also possibly on our website, but definitely on the UN website. Now, other UN human rights monitoring bodies, and Emily just mentioned the Committee on the Rights of the Child, have picked up on similar issues, which were also raised by Chinese DPOs and NGOs in alternative reports. And since the 2012 workshop, these groups have continued their discussions with each other on how to advocate for implementation of inclusive education, among other issues. And we've also had annual workshops at Hong Kong U to follow up in 2013 and 2014. So these discussions have continued. Now, an example of another human rights treaty body picking up on these issues is the Committee on the Rights of the Child's concluding comments on China's report in 2013. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child also includes a right to education. And it's been interpreted in relation to disability as a right to inclusive education as well, similar to the CRPD. So in the concluding comments, the committee expressed concerns about the persistence of the medical model of disability and the policy of actively developing segregated special schools while devoting few resources to the education of children with disabilities in mainstream schools. These are similar issues that were raised a year before by the CRPD. Now, these comments also reflect the participation of DPOs and NGOs. And in one shadow report, NGOs and DPOs critiqued draft regulations on education for people with disabilities, which was an amendment to an earlier law, or proposed amendment to an earlier law that was promulgated or was circulated in February 2013 by the Chinese authorities. And on the one hand, actually, these proposed draft regulations actually seem to be a response to the concluding comments by the CRPD, that they were trying actually to do something, right, by attempting to amend the law, and perhaps to bring something positive to their dialogue, constructive dialogue with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. Okay, there's definitely, when you read these records, there's definitely an attempt by governments, or the Chinese government anyway, to look good, right? So there's a lot of talk, all of the wonderful things that they're doing. So it helps to have something to say. Okay, so it may be that and probably, and many of the DPOs have told me that they strongly believe that the circulation of these draft regulations is actually a response to the monitoring process. But the DPOs and NGOs felt that these regulations still had a number of shortcomings, and the discussion about the draft law has continued without much resolution, actually, to date, although there have been some other developments. Now, the issues that were raised by DPOs in their shadow report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child also referred to inclusive education, the maintenance of these separate inclusive education and special education systems. And also in Article 8 of the draft regulations, there's reference to this phrase, disabled students who are qualified. Okay, so the schools have to admit, okay, it's a requirement that they admit disabled students, but only disabled students who are qualified. And I think it's actually interesting to note that in pointing out this issue, the DPOs and NGOs are revealing their own understanding of the human rights model and the social model of disability and the distinction with the medical model. Because really what they're saying is that this is problematic because rather than placing the onus on the school to change, right, to accommodate, to remove barriers, the onus is on the individual to change, to become more qualified, however, whatever that means. Okay? So the Chinese government's failure to do this also reflects a continuing misunderstanding of what disability means according to the human rights model and their requirements under the convention. Okay. Now I've also listed some other developments that may indicate some impact of the international treaty monitoring process, and also responses of the Chinese government, which are also problematic in various ways. One is the 2014 introduction of Braille exams for blind students for the Chinese university entrance exam. And this was praised, okay? There are very, very low levels of blind people that enroll in Chinese universities, low percentages. So this was, this is a great development, but the first person to take the exam didn't know Braille. And so apparently submitted blank papers and failed. And yet so there was this disconnect between the actual needs of people with impairments and real accommodation, at least for that particular person. There may be other blind applicants who would benefit from this. But for that particular person, this didn't really help him at all. And yet he went in and he sat down and he turned in his blank papers. So that was one response and potential impact that still may have problems. The State Council also introduced a plan to enhance special education from 2014 to 16. And in this plan makes a distinction between inclusive education and special education that seems to reflect the comments of the CRPD, or the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. However, there's still policies that are outlined in this plan to pursue and promote special education. Okay, so there's an acknowledgement of the difference, and yet special education is still an important piece of the policy puzzle. Okay, so based on this example of the right to education, I think it's quite clear that civil society involvement and participation has influenced the committee's review of disability rights in China. And then the concluding comments have then, in turn, influenced Chinese government policy, at least to some extent. And then civil society organizations in China are still drawing on the concluding comments and their own experience to develop and pursue domestic advocacy strategies. So once again, it's this process of human rights implementation and advocacy that's very dynamic and occurs at several levels at the same time. And as to the question of effectiveness, and again, there's been some progress, there's still a long way to go, but the fact is that the discussion is still continuing. And very recently, I think it was on April 15th, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities had a thematic day on Article 24 and inclusive education. And there were several submissions, including submissions from Hong Kong. The Equal Opportunities Commission in Hong Kong made a submission. And that will probably lead to a general comment by the committee that will then further develop the law in this area. And we are also organizing another workshop before the end of this year for Chinese DPOs focused primarily on the issue of inclusive education. So we're hoping our center to continue, and also the Disability Rights Resource Network, the website, to continue to contribute to these discussions as well. Okay, now I would like to introduce my colleague, Bonnie Tong, who has worked tirelessly along with Yulin Chung to source materials, develop the interface of the DRRN with the help of a web design company called Archually. She's organized the information coherently, arranged for translations, checking of translations, uploading, formatting the materials, all in consultation with the DPOs and NGOs that have attended our workshops. And this has not been a small task. She's worked very, very hard. First of all, I'd like to thank Bonnie. But I'm going to ask Bonnie now to come up and run through the key features of the site quickly. Is the site already up? And I should say that it's a work in progress. It's meant to be a living database. And we really would welcome your feedback and comments. I'm sure there are still some bugs. We're still uploading some of the Chinese material. But we're hoping that this will be used as a focal point for the discussions among DPOs and NGOs in mainland China and Hong Kong.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry. Can everybody hear me? Maybe I could just speak to them. All right.
Well, you know what? It's actually for the video. So.
Oh, is it? All right. All right. So this is the address of our portal. I'll just refer it as a DRRN. So it aims to serve as an information platform for those of you who are interested in knowing more about disability rights. So we target anybody who's interested in learning more about the area, including those who are not as familiar with the CRPD or the international and regional frameworks on disability rights. Therefore, we start each section with a short introduction of more general information before going into more specific areas of concern or topics of discussion. I will now quickly demonstrate with the example under key issues. So we'll go into inclusive education. So as you can see, we have focused our information, we have focused on 4 thematic areas: inclusive education, legal capacity, supported employment, and reasonable accommodation. So let's take a look at inclusive education. The structure for all 4 sections are the same. So here is the general layout and interface of the inclusive education page. For example, if I go into the treaty-based bodies, you'll first see a quick introduction of what UN treaty-based bodies mean. And then we will go into more specific details. For example, for concluding observations, again, we'll have a page introducing what concluding observations are, and then going into more specific details of the concluding observations specifically on inclusive education. We have taken out excerpts from these concluding observations from each country reports. As you can see, so we have paragraph. We have China, Spain, Peru, etc. So other than international framework, we have also included information on regional framework, namely the European, Inter-American, and African frameworks. So under each, again, we'll have a general introduction of each framework. So this is European. We also have included some case summaries of jurisprudence of these different frameworks. For example, the European Court of Human Rights and European Committee of Social Rights. Other than a short summary, we will soon provide a longer summary. And then we'll have some information on mainland China, for example, like the legislation, policies, and cases or news surrounding this particular thematic area. And lastly, we also have summarized articles or reports. So these are mostly academic articles on each area. There is some copyright concerns of actually uploading the article. Yeah, but we're going to upload the full article once we get clearance from the particular publisher. Okay, and then another highlight is under the advocacy tab. We have included some pretty useful advocacy toolkits and manuals. Again, we have some on general advocacy, and we have also included a few on the specific thematic areas, such as support employment and reasonable accommodation. So there are a few features that we would like to highlight. The first is actually, we have provided a memorandum summarizing the jurisprudence on disability rights and the specific thematic areas under the UN framework and the regional frameworks. For example, this is our memorandum on legal capacity. So you'll see that we have summarized what Article 12 of the CRPD is about. And the general comments, the main points of the general comments. And we have also consolidated the recommendations made by the CRPD in concluding observations on how state parties could further rights of persons with disabilities in the area of legal capacity. We also provide summaries to cases, and since we aim to reach a broader audience, we try to draft these summaries in more reader-friendly ways, and we tried to avoid using very technical or legal jargon. And also we have a quick news and events update on the homepage.
In case you missed it, the talk is today.
So anything that's relevant to disability rights, for example, the workshop on inclusive education later this year will be having some, maybe like a blurb on our portal about it.
And we'll put Simon's workshop up.
Yes, yes, as possible. So you click into it, it takes you to the full introduction of the particular news and event. And and upcoming features. We will have a forum that needs that would need a username and password in order to access. We aim to facilitate some more private conversations and discussions among NGOs, DPOs, and international experts. That will be up soon. Our web designers are working on that.
There were some security issues.
Yeah. And the Chinese versions will also be launched soon. Again, there are some encoding issues. There are some weird characters that came up after the first trial. And
I guess I should also just mention that we've had several student projects this year related to disability rights, working on manuals and other projects for Chosen Power, for example, and also some street law curricula about the CRPD that students in the Equality and Non-Discrimination course this semester have produced. And they're very sort of fun, interactive lesson plans about how to teach about the CRPD to secondary school students and other lay people. And we'll also be uploading some of this work that's been done by students.
And we've also uploaded some of the discussion notes that took place at the Disability Rights Workshop at HKU last October. So as you can see, these are the notes. So we had 4 breakout sessions during the workshop, and each group had produced, they have presented their findings and discussions during the workshop, and we have consolidated the information and uploaded to our portal. Yeah, so we welcome any comments.
Comments and questions.
Hi, thanks. First, congratulations. I think it's an excellent resource that a lot of groups would find very interesting and helpful, especially those who want to mobilize, disability groups and things like that. So well done, congratulations, and hopefully all the things will be sorted out with the Chinese websites and things like that. Yeah. 2 quick questions. The first one is about you used the word misunderstanding by the Chinese government about the difference between the medical model and human rights model.
Is that too diplomatic?
I'm just wondering that I don't think they're stupid. A lot of times there might be some pragmatic reasons that they are still wanting to hold on to an old model of having this old style way of dealing with disability, especially the schools and the special schools.
You're right.
Yeah. The second question is really about the last time you held this workshop here, you invited Hong Kong groups, right, and also groups from mainland China. And you mentioned that the Hong Kong groups were much more vocal, wanting to do things and all that. But, the Chinese groups were more restrained. Is that because they fear that when they go back to China that, they might get harassed? Because that's my experience with a number of groups from mainland China. They are quite sort of do self-censorship. So quite careful, because if they say anything that's against the official line taken by the China Disabled Persons Federation, they might get into trouble. So is that the case? There's this fear of harassment? Thank you.
Thank you. Your first question, yeah, I was quite diplomatic, I suppose, in my presentation of the misunderstandings. But yes, I mean, talking to the DPOs that have been coming to Hong Kong U for the workshops, I've learned more about some of the reasons behind this promotion of special education. I think there are a lot of vested interests at stake in developing these schools and building these schools. And it would be very difficult, actually, to extricate from this policy approach. That's my understanding. I'm being slightly vague about it. I mean, I don't know a lot about the details. Maybe other people in the room would like to add to that. Is there anybody who wants to add anything? Or you want to be diplomatic? And your second question about the reticence of the Chinese groups to actually submit alternative reports to the committees, the UN committees. In 2012, I mean, I was talking about the experience in 2012, and I think part of it was a lot of the groups were very new to the idea of international human rights monitoring. The CRPD was still fairly new. As I said, China was one of the first states to ratify, one of the first states to report. So it was all sort of new, and there was maybe some caution because of that. I think also caution because of the concerns of advocacy, human rights advocacy groups generally in mainland China. However, there was one group that did submit an alternative report in its own name, and I believe there were no serious repercussions.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, about the medical model rather than the... I work with the Little People of Hong Kong, which is really dealing with children with rare bone diseases that result in dwarfism. And we had at Shenzhen Hospital, which is the Hong Kong U Hospital in Shenzhen in China, we had a combined meeting with the more than 1,000 parents and kids from the mainland with dwarfism. I think it's also a market demand. Most parents were really interested in, could you cure my child? You know, is there something they can take? So I think it has a lot to do not only with government policies, but also parents and patients wanting to correct their physical condition. And for that reason, I think we have to be a little more patient because basically China is still a huge stigma if you have physical disabilities.
Yeah, I mean, the social model of disability has been critiqued by some disability rights advocates because it doesn't, because it moves too far away. I mean, some of the more extreme versions of the social, too far away from medical, it sort of discounts the potential benefits of medical treatment. And some people want medical treatment. I think the social model is more about, well, you don't assume that people want medical treatment. And there are people, for example, in the deaf community, I mean, deaf culture is very strong in many societies, and the language, identification of the language is very strong. It's part of their cultural identity, not just an impairment. And I've talked to some deaf people who actually wouldn't, even if they could, wouldn't necessarily want medical treatment to be able to hear again. So it's about choice, it's about autonomy as well. But I agree with you. I mean, sometimes the social model pulls us a bit too far away from real medical needs and real medical treatment that's available. I mean, we have a lot of experts in the room on disability and human rights in China. I'd be curious to if anybody has, if you disagreed with anything that I said, or if you have anything to add.
Not at all an expert, but I've been involved in the first round of going to the UN on the CRPD. And then back in Hong Kong, we were talking about from medical model to social model. and then a human rights model. And I was thinking whether there's a spectrum of choices where we can advocate that people can have different entry point, like little people, as I heard, and then many other different category of disabilities. They still want the medical model. Parents want, and the government surely familiarized with the medical model. So is there an idea ever coming up of a spectrum of a spectrum of needs and advocate to move on? That's what I'm thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, or I mean, medical treatment, again, can be approached according to a human rights framework, right? So if you apply these principles of human rights that I was talking about, then the solutions, even the medical solutions, right, would have to proceed in a certain manner, right? So it would help guide that process. When you talk about a spectrum, I guess I see it as, well, yes, medical treatment can be very important, but it has to be done in a way that would comply with human rights obligations at the same time. I mean, another point about the medical model is sometimes people's attitudes about medical treatment or wanting to, cure the disability is based on negative societal attitudes about people with impairments and people with disabilities. And part of what the convention requires of governments is to actually do some public awareness-raising campaigns, that kind of thing, to try to address the stigma about disability and impairment. And it's possible that if that stigma is actually eliminated and people with impairments are just accepted, as I said, as part of human diversity, that there may not be as much of an emphasis on trying to get rid of the impairment in certain cases. Yes, Fernando.
Congratulations on launching this very useful website, and of course the whole effort of promoting human rights model. And I don't think there are intrinsic conflicts or exclusions of medical services or other services from the human rights model. I think it would be a misnomer to think that if one adopts a human rights model, then we forget about the basic services that are needed. It is a matter of a philosophical approach rather than looking at whether one provides medical services and the other simply looking at things only from the protection of human rights. But anyways, it is a great, useful website, and the whole effort is great, but I certainly hope that you would also devote more efforts into the local concerns. It'd be great if you include more materials concerning, yes, I'm looking at the materials concerning Hong Kong, and there's still a lot of things that we should have been done, as outlined in the concluding remarks here. And surely we hope we could collaborate more, and not only by you guys providing more resources and guidelines and so forth. There are real problems happening on the ground here in Hong Kong, and how could we use your help in terms of not only the legal resources, but perhaps, I don't know, advice on policy development, and at times even dealing with individual cases. I don't know if there are possibilities of such. But anyways, there are many problems we're still facing on a daily basis. Just the other day I had a deaf student in the secondary school who approached my office saying that he's deprived of the sign language. He's in a conventional mainstream school, which was used by the Education Bureau as a very successful school in helping deaf students, or students with hearing impairment. And lo and behold, the you know, a week after I heard that from the Education Bureau, a student from that very school came to my office saying he didn't find the school very helpful. He didn't blame the school though. He said the school lacks resources in hiring someone who could, you know, do the sign language for him. And it's getting more difficult for him because he's approaching to take the DSE. And it's getting more difficult for him to catch up. So he's been dealing with these difficulties without much help all along. And he was successful so far, but it's getting to be too hard for him. So it's very ironic that while we're talking about a lot of problems in China, we in a fluid environment, much more advanced in terms of legal and other perspective, other areas, we're still looking at a lot of the basic needs not being taken care of. So, you know, I just hope that we could also adopt a local perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we intend to do that. And we have also included the NGOs, DPOs from Hong Kong in the workshops that we've held. And there's been some very fruitful interactions between mainland groups and groups in Hong Kong. I mean, one idea that we have as we develop the website going forward is to also have kind of discussions where we put up particular cases, right, or particular issues, and then we get a discussion going, a public discussion, not just sort of a discussion forum, where we have, I don't know if you've ever seen the New York Times discussions where they pose an issue, then they have 4 different experts views on that issue. And we have a lot of experts who've been involved locally, regionally, also international experts who come to the workshops and participated, who are really excited about what's happening in Hong Kong as well, and have offered to help us with this and actually provide advice and provide, you know, get a discussion going around how best to advocate. So the website can be used for that purpose as well, I think, going forward. But also we can discuss other ways that we can get involved. Thank you.
Very happy.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, congratulations, and for the website to move a little bit forward, and if you have resources, of course, you know what I'm asking for the easy read.
Yes.
At least not trying to, of course, the basic concepts and framework would be the best. And also, if it's possible, at least no matter it's in EU or UK, some other part of the countries, they already have some very interesting easy read references. And actually, we can ask them and then put a link. And at least we can have an English version or even German version, and then we can, if they are open to us, and then we can translate into Chinese.
That's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just further comment on the economics. I think, let me use an example. My niece is a little person. She's normal in every sense. Beautiful young lady, but just really short. She received a PhD from UCLA in anthropology and others, which is 2 actually. And a very famous university employed her on condition she doesn't sue the university, precisely because they found it too expensive to convert toilets for her. So they asked if she could provide her own stepping, steps wherever she goes. And that brings in a real question of the economics. And perhaps that's another issue in China as well. The economics of converting all the schools. I'm master of St. John's College, and I'm frequently being challenged. Why is it that, you know, your hall of residence is so physically unfriendly? We are on a mountainside, and we were built in 1956 and 79, and you are living in the newest one, 97. Before the laws came in place. We have asked how much it would cost to convert St. John's to accommodate wheelchairs. it'll cost about $50 million. That's one. And even if we convert, traffic department refused to do anything about the pavements, so that wheelchairs could come to Hong Kong U, precisely because there's no way they could cut the slopes anymore to widen the pavements. So there's a lot of issues in there. But so there are certain constraints as to how far we can go. And it's real, you know. It's. But the other thing too is that you are very right in saying that to change people's attitude is very, very difficult. My niece, her husband, who is 6 foot something tall, and she's about less than 3. And he's been arrested several times for having sex with minor. It's like because my niece is social. And she's been stopped by police constantly for being a child driving a huge car. You know, and so that's that kind of harassment that they face as well. But what I'm bringing all of this up in saying that as medical conditions improve and children like this, you know, less and less occurrence. And in China, the economics, so many of these children born are left to die or abandoned. So how far do we go in accommodating? I think it's a real issue we have to face.
And I mean, the convention has the concept of reasonable accommodation,
exactly.
right? And there are these concepts of undue burden, right, or in Hong Kong law, unjustifiable hardship, right? And it's very difficult sometimes to figure out where to draw the line. I mean, I wonder though, even providing a step stool probably wouldn't cost that much. And sometimes accommodation really doesn't take that much. I mean, I was thinking of my own experience having a blind student in class last year, where I had to do things in order to accommodate. I had to read everything in the slide, for example, or if I showed a video, I would explain what was happening in the pictures to the whole class. It didn't cost me anything. I just had to think about it, right? So sometimes, I mean, it's important to talk about costs and it's important to talk about where to draw the line, but sometimes we forget that actually accommodation often doesn't really take that much. I mean, I remember reading about a case that the EOC conciliated many years ago in the education sector in Hong Kong, where somebody in a wheelchair, was told that they couldn't, because there were steps up to the bathroom, the student bathroom, he couldn't come to school, right? Because he couldn't use the bathroom. I mean, there was a staff bathroom on the ground floor, and finally, the EOC conciliated with the school, and they said, "All right, well, he can use the staff." It didn't cost the school anything, right? Sometimes it can be more straightforward, but you're absolutely right to point out that often costs are an issue, and those discussions have to be had.
And I remember having a discussion with some of the students from Kelley's equality class, and they're asking exactly the same question. They're like, so if it costs a lot to actually provide full accommodation, then what should the institution, like the school or the employer or the government do, right? And I think we need to remember that reasonable accommodation, it's also a spectrum, right? You don't, even if you cannot provide like the best accommodation, you can still provide some accommodation that would make everybody's life easier.
One more question.
Just one. If I may, just one.
Anyone who needs to leave,
just
I
one
understand,
comment.
but this is really
First,
helpful.
congratulations, big congratulations to you and your team on a great job. And I particularly like the style, the way that you present the information, make it very friendly, direct, simple. And if I may suggest, just one suggestion is that maybe to cover Taiwan as well, because they've got excellent, I mean, in terms of the legislation, they have a lot that we can learn from, like the special education act, as well as the act concerning about the rights of disabled persons, kind of modeling on ADA and IDM of the United States. And the practice, the NGOs are very, very mature. They've got vibrant civil society, which we can learn from. Although I know talking about civil society in China is just too dangerous. It's kind of like a taboo now. But I think the experience shouldn't be missed out.
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, we included experts from Taiwan
Right.
in the last workshop that we had in October for that reason, and also because, look, it was easier in terms of language for some of the Chinese groups to interact with the Taiwanese experts. But yeah, they're doing a lot, and I think we can also rely on them since they're involved now for materials. So that's a good idea.
Actually, with Taiwan, I think we can. We're going to ask for permission for those experts who came to our workshop because they prepared very detailed PowerPoint presentations at the workshop. So I think we can ask them for permission to upload those PowerPoints to the website.
Thank you all very much for coming and for your suggestions and comments. And please continue to provide suggestions as we go along and keep checking the website to see how we're doing. And thank you very much.
Thank you.